Welcome to the Computational Sustainability Virtual Seminar Series. The scheduled presentations, as well as recordings of selected presentations of the past, can be found at the URL at the center of this screen. We are happy to offer this opportunity to those interested in computing and sustainability across the globe at small and large institutions alike. The virtual seminar series is being organized by CompSusNet with support from the National Science Foundation and Cornell University. My name is Doug Fisher, and I'm the Director for Outreach, Education, Diversity, and Synthesis of CompSusNet. During the webinar, you can ask questions through the question and answer facility on Zoom, which will be relayed to the speaker as time allows. If you would like to ask the question yourself, please say so in the chat window, and we will cue you. If you'd like, find the chat window now and write hello to everyone. And you can also use that chat window to ask questions in the future. Today, it is our pleasure to have Angela Fuller, who's an associate professor at Cornell University, as well as the unit lead of the New York Cooperative Fish and Wildlife Research Unit. So Angela, you can take it over.
All right, thanks Doug for the introduction. Can you hear me okay?
I hear you great.
And can you see that?
Yep.
Okay, this is a new experience for me, this virtual seminar, so I hope it all goes well here. I'm going to move these bars that are in my way here somewhere. All right. So thanks, Doug, for the introduction. And before I get started, I'd like to mention that I'm an ecologist, and I'm giving a talk in this seminar series because the conservation and management problems that I typically confront require complex computational solutions, which is the reason that I've engaged with collaborations with a number of folks in the Computational Sustainability Research Network. And given that, as you may expect, my talk might be a departure from some of the other talks that you may have heard in this seminar series. And so this is the perspective of an ecologist, not a computer scientist. And I'd like to acknowledge my collaborators and co-authors on this work. There's a large number of folks that have been involved in this research, including Andy Royal at the USGS Patuxent Wildlife Research Center, Carla Gomes, Ye Shin, and Xiao Jian at the Institute for Computational Sustainability at Cornell, Bistrel Dilkaina and Amrita Gupta at Georgia Tech, Chris Sutherland at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, and Dana Moran, who is a former postdoc of ours and is now at Virginia Tech. And before I get started here, I'd like to mention that most of the work that I deal with deals with biodiversity conservation. And when we think about biodiversity conservation, sustainability is often expressed as a common goal. But it's seldom expressed as an objective that can be measured or is measurable, and it's rarely empirically measured and evaluated. And when we think about sustainability, there's a lot of conflicting objectives. So if you look at the photograph on the right, this is a landscape in Ecuador. It's a multi-use landscape. We're thinking about conflicting objectives of how to maintain landscapes for species and for the communities that live within that area. So there's resource use objectives that may be conflicting, as well as biodiversity objectives that may be conflicting. And so landscape planning is really needed to integrate these conflicting biodiversity and economic and social and resource sustainability objectives. But the big question is exactly how do we do that? It's a complex problem, and it's a complex spatial problem. And that leads me to the work that we've been engaged in, this larger group. And I mentioned the collaborators on one aspect of this project, but the project that I'm going to be talking about is actually larger than the folks that are just involved in this piece here. And at the end of the talk, I'll mention some other folks who are involved in this work. So the project title is Landscape Scale Conservation in the Ecuadorian Andes, the Socio-Ecological Corridor. And the overarching goal of this sustainable landscape design is to support both human quality of life and conservation. And that is, we want to provide ecosystem goods for human benefit conservation of biodiversity and also maintenance of the area's cultural diversity. But often protected areas are criticized for the exclusion of people and traditional livelihoods. And I mentioned we're in an area that's a multi-use landscape. It's not a protected area. So we need to combine conservation and working landscapes and consider these multiple objectives in the design of landscapes. The area that I'm talking about is in Ecuador, and Ecuador is considered one of 17 megadiverse countries of the world, and it sits within 2 of the world's biodiversity hotspots. And a biodiversity hotspot is an area that has exceptional concentrations of endemic species and is also experiencing exceptional loss of habitat. And the tropical Andes, one of the areas within our study area, is the most diverse of all of the hotspots, ranked first in the total number of species and also the number of endemic species in 4 of 6 categories. Those are listed on the left. Those are vascular plants, terrestrial vertebrates, birds, and amphibians. There's a lot of mammalian species of conservation concern within this region. There's the Andean bear. This is the species for which I'll be talking about today. But there's also pumas and all these really cool spotted cat species as well. And not only are there mammalian species of conservation concern that are either threatened or endangered or sensitive species, there's a whole host of endemic bird species as well as bird species that are sensitive to increasing rates of habitat loss and fragmentation. So that brings us to thinking about how do we conserve these large landscapes. And one tool for simplifying conservation planning is to think about using a focal species. And if you think about a focal species, that's a species for which if you were to protect the habitat or the requirements of that species and provide enough of the resource for that focal species, presumably it'll provide enough of the resources for these other species. So oftentimes you can think about these as focal species or umbrella species, where the species is providing an umbrella for all of the other species that fall underneath it. And the Andean bear is a good species to use as a focal species. You could also consider it a flagship species because it's pretty charismatic. I mean, look at that face there. Who would not love that? But the Andean bears have a number of features that make them good for a focal species. That is, they're vulnerable to extinction. The IUCN has listed them as vulnerable. There's only about 20,000 individuals globally. In Ecuador, they're endangered. They're also area sensitive. They require pretty large areas from 15 to 60 square kilometers and even upwards of 160 square kilometers. So Andean bears really represent a range of spatial requirements for other less area sensitive species. In addition to that, they have a seasonal use of habitats. They follow the seasonal pulse of resources, so they're not necessarily static in their range, that they're moving about the landscape pretty widely. And they also use a large elevation range from 600 meters all the way up to 4,800 meters. So they represent a diversity of landscape uses that are useful for other species. Now the problem is the global distribution of Andean bears is a little precarious, as you see in this picture on the left here. The habitat range is about 260 square kilometers, and it's in a very narrow band that's only 200 to 650 kilometers wide and about 4,600 kilometers long. And so as you can imagine, when you're dealing with conservation of a population that exists in this really long kind of narrow band, that any kind of fragmentation can result in isolation of these individual populations. Now, the population size you'll see that I've displayed here is anywhere between 5,000 and 30,000. And you might think, wow, can't you do better than that? Well, that's the best that we can do right now in terms of estimating what the global population size of Andean bears are. There's not a lot of work that have been done on Andean bears, especially in estimating Andean bear abundance or density. Now, if we kind of zoom in to the area of interest, the area that we're working in Ecuador, Ecuador has about 58,000 square kilometers of the habitat within the global distribution, and that's in those areas of orange in the photograph of Ecuador on the right. And this represents 22% of the global distribution of Andean bears. And within this area, there's estimated to be about 2,000 individuals. And that's again a question mark. And I probably should have put a larger question mark at the end of that, because really the number of individuals in Ecuador is really uncertain. Now, I mentioned we're working on a sustainable landscape management problem.
Angela?
And yes.
Can you go back?
Sure.
One slide.
Yep.
Yeah, these estimates, and I suspect those, what are those orange, darker oranges that where you estimate the population is?
That's actually just simply based on the habitat, suitable habitat for Andean bears. It's not based on any empirical studies that have estimated densities.
Okay, that was exactly my question. That is just the suitable habitat for Andean bears. Okay.
Yeah, that's right. Yep. And in fact, these estimates, just to elaborate on this, the population estimates are coming from inferences from black bears in North America. And so they're basically, that's the best information available on a similar species. So not very much confidence in this population size. So kind of fast forward here to the corridor idea. I mentioned we're doing this corridor design, and we're working with the Secretary of Environment of the Metropolitan District of Quito. And if my cursor works, yeah, can you see the cursor? Yes? Okay. I can see heads nodding there, so I assume that's yes. Here's the Metropolitan District of Quito here. We're zoomed into this area here. And the Secretary of Environment in Ecuador designated an area they called a corridor for Andean bears. But it's not the traditional word corridor that you might think about. It's essentially a line that's drawn on the map that represents areas that have suitable habitat for Andean bears. The corridor doesn't provide any kind of protection for Andean bears. It's simply designation of an area that they're doing information and education and outreach to try to represent Andean bears as a species for which conservation efforts should be focused. So this is the area that's being considered as a corridor. It's 650 square kilometers. The interest of us in this work is to think about which of the areas within that area that's being called a corridor are the most important to protect. And so can we actually think about developing an actual connected landscape management plan within this region, and then ultimately connecting this region here to a large ecological reserve to the north, Cotacachi-Cayapas, that's about 3,000 square kilometers, and then to another ecological reserve to the south, that's about 1,400 square kilometers. Now, this area here is entirely, between these protected areas, is entirely a multi-use landscape. It's not protected at all. There's human populations that live there, a lot of communities within that area. Santiago Molina is a researcher in Ecuador, and he began some camera trapping work of Andean bears in Ecuador. And based on the cameras that he had out there, we have provided the first density estimate of Andean bears in Ecuador. We have a paper in press right now that will be reporting the density of Andean bears within this region at 7.45 bears per 100 square kilometers. So that means we're estimating about 40 bears to be in this area in the slide here to the right. Now this led us to design a larger scale field study. So using the information from the Molina study, which was limited to not very many sampling sites, we implemented a large scale field study last year. And this is the area of the corridor outlined in purple here. And what we've done is we divided up this area into 31 grid cells that are 25 square kilometers each, and those are outlined in yellow. And the 25 square kilometers approximates the home range size of a female Andean bear. And then within each one of those grid cells, you'll see these circles here. Those are the stations in which we put remote trail cameras. And for folks who aren't familiar with these, they're basically like a game camera that you put out, and they're motion activated. It has an infrared. And so if an individual walks by, it triggers the camera and takes a photograph of the species that's walking by. Of course, our target species is Andean bears, but we're collecting all of these other species that happen to walk by the cameras as well. And so the end result are photographs like this, where you get the picture of the Andean bear. Now, within this area, we had these 2 to 3 camera stations per grid cell, and we had 101 cameras total that we monitored for 3 months. The circles in red are the stations or the cameras that had detections of Andean bears. So you can see there are 23 camera stations where we detected our target species, Andean bears. Now we just recently implemented the second phase of this, and we're resampling these areas for another 3 months. We just started the field season last month. Some preliminary results of this from last year. We ended up with 240,000 or over 240,000 photographs, quite a large number. 27,000 of them are photographs of animals. The reason why there's so many more photographs than photographs of animals is because of things like this. Oftentimes you get pictures with nothing in it, but the camera is triggered by, for example, a leaf flapping or something like that. So we have 27,000 photographs to go through that have either an animal or a person in it, 24 different mammal species that we have captured on these trail cameras, and over 6,000 photographs of Andean bears. Now the Andean bears, as you can see here, this is a photograph from one of our camera traps, and this is a photograph from an actual SLR camera that's an Andean bear in a tree, so you can see it zoomed in a little bit better. But the purpose of me showing you these is that the Andean bears have distinctive facial markings that allow us to identify individuals. So with these photographs, we can look at the pattern on the face, and then we can identify individual Andean bears from the photographs. Now this leads me to say, okay, we've done this camera trapping study, and now we need to think about how do we conserve populations of Andean bears. And spatial structure occurs in animal populations that utilize and are distributed across multiple habitat types. Whether this is part of the natural ecology of the species or it's imposed on the population through either like disturbance or some kind of anthropogenic change to the landscape, most species exhibit some form of spatial structure. And there's 2 primary elements of conservation of spatially structured populations. The first one is maintaining populations that have enough individuals. And of course, the number of individuals required is going to vary by species, but it should allow the population to be robust to demographic stochasticity. And the second is to maintain connectivity. And the idea is to permit enough levels or sufficient levels of dispersal and gene flow so that the populations are robust to genetic stochasticity. However, connectivity, like sustainability I mentioned earlier on, is rarely expressed as a measurable objective, and it's rarely quantified and measured from observations of individuals like we collect on these camera trap studies. I mentioned this is part of a corridor design or a landscape management plan. And for folks who aren't familiar with the purpose of corridors, it's a region of the landscape that helps to facilitate movement of individuals. And the idea is to increase gene flow and reduce rates of inbreeding from isolated populations. And ultimately, the goal, long-term goal, is to increase fitness and survival of the species. And there's a lot of debate in the literature, however, that is asking the question, are corridors actually providing connectivity? Are corridors actually effective in terms of maintaining populations of species? Now, I should inform you about some definitions of connectivity, so we're all on the same page here. A general definition of connectivity is a linkage between resource patches for a given species. And there's 2 different ways that we can think about defining connectivity. The first way is structural connectivity. And this is just the physical relationship between different elements of the landscape. So that might be characterized as the total amount of habitat or the spatial configuration of habitat. And this is really ignoring the behavioral response of organisms to that landscape structure. But functional connectivity is another way that we can measure connectivity. And this is defined as the degree to which the landscape is either facilitating or impeding the movement of organisms. And in this case, functional connectivity is a product of both the landscape structure and the response of the organism to that landscape structure. There are a large number of landscape management efforts that are focused on corridor design, and there's a lot of variability in the different objectives and approaches that folks use to select different parcels of land to include in a corridor. But most of them are focused on the number of individuals and maintaining connectivity. Those are kind of the two primary objectives. But conservation and management approaches still often address density or abundance and connectivity as separate objectives, even when the goal is to conserve both. And that leads me to consider this issue of pattern versus process. And so most of the corridor work is focused largely on the pattern of landscape structure, that is the structural connectivity, how much suitable habitat is there, what's the interpatch distance, and things that we can actually measure from the landscape. But the impetus for corridor design is really the process of animal movement. That's really what we're concerned about, how individuals can move across the landscape. So really we should be focused on aspects of functional connectivity, how the individual is responding to the landscape structure and is able to move about in a landscape. So the two most critical processes that are required to maintain these spatially structured populations that I've defined are both abundance and connectivity. And again, these are often considered separately, and typically considerations about connectivity are focused on dispersal, kind of large scale, long movement dispersal processes. But if we think about how individuals select habitat or resources, their resource selection pressures are weakened during dispersal. So we're suggesting instead to focus on movements about a home range to infer landscape connectivity. And the influence of stochastic variation in the environment, like reproduction or mortality, is higher for small populations than it is for larger ones. So I'm suggesting that the abundance of populations in addition to connectivity is important. So this kind of stochastic variation in demographic rates cause small populations to fluctuate randomly in size, and the smaller the population, the greater the probability that the fluctuations can lead to local extinctions. And so therefore, we're suggesting that density is important. So the main point then is that a focus on only patches of suitable habitat without concern for connectivity can result in isolated populations, while focus only on species distributions and conserving gene flow won't identify areas of decreased abundance or degraded habitat or areas that are important for seasonal resources. So both connectivity and density are important when we're thinking about maintaining these spatially structured populations. So I mentioned connectivity is important. And the way that connectivity is characterized is often by how resistant the landscape is to animal movement. And resistance is actually not often estimated. Rather, it's based on expert opinion. And so if we look at this, the picture on the left here, you have a housing development that's adjacent to a forest stand. And you would ask a bunch of experts to say, or to ask them, how resistant do you think housing development is compared to a forest and for the individual species? And in this case, the forest is less resistant to movement. It facilitates movement more than housing development. And the experts would say, okay, well, forest gets a value of 1, but it's 100 times more difficult for this individual to travel through a housing development, and the housing development gets a value of 100. So this results in this issue of subjective translation, in that the analyst or whoever is doing the kind of effort to characterize resistance subjectively decides how to translate measures of resource selection into resistance. So sometimes they might be based on habitat selection studies, for example, but it's not estimated from actual data. Not often. Now there's two technological developments that move us in a new direction. One is non-invasive sampling, which I'll describe in the next slide. And the second is spatial capture-recapture. And so very generally here, spatial capture-recapture allows us to address questions of spatial population ecology from ordinary encounter history data. That is a spatial location of where we're detecting these individuals across the landscape. And this allows us to estimate the two most critical processes to maintain these spatially structured populations. That is abundance and connectivity. And we can do this simultaneously with this model, which I'll describe in more detail. So first, I mentioned non-invasive sampling being kind of this new technology. Now, historically, the way that we would sample animal populations is we'd actually have to go out there, we'd have to trap them or capture them and physically handle the individuals. But, you know, starting about 20 years ago, there are these methods that allow us to non-invasively sample species. So one example of that is using non-invasive genetic approaches. And so we can use things like these scat detection dogs. They're dogs that are highly trained to sniff out the scat of specific species. And we can collect that scat, we can extract the DNA, and then we can tell which individual left that particular scat. So not only the species, but also the individual. We can also use non-invasive genetics. For example, in the picture on the lower right, there's a bunch of gun brushes on this tree, and the fisher climbs up this tree to get this yummy piece of beaver meat that's in the middle of these gun brushes, and unknowingly leaves behind a sample of hair that we can extract the DNA and then identify which fisher climbed up that tree. Now we can also use camera traps. So this isn't a genetic approach, but it's a non-invasive approach whereby we're trying to capture these pictures of individuals. And for species that have distinctive markings, like the Andean bear, we can identify the facial mask and identify individuals that way. Or for example, jaguars have individual spot patterns, and we can identify individuals like that. So the new movement towards non-invasive collection of data allow us a lot more information from a lot more individuals across a much larger landscape than historically we could ever sample. Now, before I describe spatial capture-recapture, I want to highlight classical capture-recapture. So most folks might be familiar with classical capture-recapture type of work. So capture-recapture is a statistical method that's been used to study animal population for decades. It's pretty well known. So it's a class of models for estimating population size and other parameters from individual encounter history data. And it gives a record of when each individual is captured. So for example, if you sample a population repeatedly over time and you record whether the individual is captured or encountered or not, in each sample, the result, as in the example that I'm showing here, is a sequence of binary random variables that indicate whether the individuals are either encountered or not in each sample. And so what you have here is you have each individual, and each time that you go out and sample it, you record whether the individual is encountered, a 1, or not encountered, a 0. Now, capture-recapture models involve parameters that describe both population structure, like survival probability or population size, but also parameters that describe the observation process, that is, the probability of encountering an individual in a particular trap or device. So information about the repeated captures or not of individuals tells you about this capture process, and if you know about that, then you can deduce things like how many of these all 0 encounter histories are there. And so in effect, this n is unknown, and that's what we wish to evaluate. Now, there's several limitations of classical capture-recapture methods. And the major one that I'm going to mention here is that they don't use any spatial data. They use nothing about the spatial information. But in reality, almost all actual studies produce encounter data that are both temporally and spatially indexed. So these classical capture-recapture models end up reducing the data to simple individual encounter histories. So for example, if you look here, you have a spatial encounter history where you have individual I that's caught in trap J over some time period or visit K. Now, in the traditional or classical capture-recapture model, basically all of this information about which trap it was captured in is discarded, and it turns into a two-dimensional time series where we just have which individual was caught in which visit, but the information on the trap is not there anymore. So why do we have to do this? Well, capture-recapture models or these classical capture-recapture models have no spatially indexed variables or parameters. So we have to apply these, if we apply these models, then we need to summarize the data. So to do that, we summarize over the spatial dimension. Now that brings me to spatial capture-recapture, which, as you can imagine, obviates this problem of getting rid of the spatial information. So you can see this book here. This is a book by Andy Royal and co-authors. Andy's a collaborator on this project, which describes in detail spatial capture-recapture. So in a general sense, spatial capture-recapture is a capture-recapture model for individual observations that are then augmented with a model that describes how individuals are organized or distributed in space. So what it's doing is it's linking a model regarding animal sampling with an ecological process, and it's an analysis framework that allows us to address problems or questions in spatial population ecology from these ordinary encounter history data that come from capture-recapture studies that I mentioned. So for example, the camera trap data, or the hair snare data, or the non-invasive genetic data, where we can identify individuals in different traps. Now, in a sense, this is kind of SCR in a nutshell here. Spatial capture-recapture is this methodological framework that's combining a spatially explicit observation model that describes how the individuals are encountered in these traps with a statistical point process model that describes how the individuals are distributed in space. So spatial capture-recapture is this extension of the classical capture-recapture that I just described, but it's made possible by merging the spatially explicit model for the encounter history data with the spatially explicit model that describes how the individuals are distributed in space. So the goal here is to achieve statistical inference about the spatial structure of the populations from the observed encounters of a sample of individuals in these different traps. So how do we get space into these capture-recapture models? So we can think about characterizing a model that describes how individuals are organized or distributed in space. And that is, if you think about individuals as point locations, then we can describe the distributions of individuals in space as a Poisson point process. So if we imagine that individuals are represented by points on the landscape, and of course, individuals aren't static, right? So they're kind of moving about within some kind of home range. So instead, we can think about these as home range or activity centers. But we don't really know where these home range or activity centers are in practice, so we treat these as latent variables in the model. So by doing this, it's natural to link the individual locations of capture in these different traps using the standard capture-recapture encounter model with distance from the trap as a covariate. So the distance between the trap and this individual activity center, which is this latent variable. So in this picture here, you have a series of detectors or traps indicated by these pluses, and you have these red dots are indicating these home range centers. So what are the essential elements of spatial capture-recapture? Well, basically, there's three different elements that define this methodology of spatial capture-recapture. The first one is there's a point process model for these home range centers. And this is kind of the key element of the spatial capture-recapture model. The second one is an observation model that's spatially explicit, of course, and it's defined for any possible trap or sample location X in any possible home range center S. And here I've described those trap-specific encounters as independent Bernoulli trials, but you can use other observation models. So for example, if you have some kind of sampling device and you can detect an individual at some arbitrary number of times during a particular sampling interval, you could then use an observation model for encounter frequencies, like a Poisson model, for example. The third element of this is detection probability. So there's a detection function that connects the point process model and the observation model. And this is kind of everything put together on one very large slide with a lot of information. So the basic capture-recapture model is based on the assumption that individuals are moving around within a circular home range, and that we're more likely to detect individuals at the center of that home range and less likely to detect those individuals the farther the trap is away from their activity center. And that's what's shown here, where we have the distance between the individual activity center S and trap location J. So as the distance between the trap location and the individual activity center increases, the probability that you're going to encounter that individual declines. And that's what's shown here, where we're more likely to detect this individual the closer it is to its home range center, red, than we are farther away from that home range center. Now, the encounter model, the model for encounter probability depends on some parameters that we need to estimate. And this is kind of the key point of this, is that it usually takes the point of some Euclidean distance between the sample locations and that latent variable that we're describing as the home range center or individual activity center. So that's what we're just describing here, is the Euclidean distance between the activity center and the trap location. So the basic model based on Euclidean distance implies that space use is symmetric, so it's circular and it's centered on this activity center S, and it's also stationary, regardless of the location of the surrounding landscape structure. So the spatial capture-recapture encounter probability model has this kind of heuristic interpretation as a simplistic model of space usage. And because these home range centers are regarded as latent variables, we don't know where they are in practice, of course, so we need a model for them to account for their uncertain state. And a natural model for thinking about the population of those latent variables is to assume them to be a realization of a spatial point process model. So, for example, uniformity. But we could also think about inhomogeneous density models or inhomogeneous point process models if the local point density depends on some kind of landscape or habitat covariate, for example. So the interesting thing, or the great thing about these models, of course, is that we can make inference about density. So we can model explicit factors that influence density. Now here's an example from a black bear study in New York. Here we had a series of hair snares that we set out across the landscape. And using this model, we can evaluate these explicit factors such as elevation, shown here, that influence density. And then we can estimate population size in this photo right here, which is just the sum of all of the pixel-specific population sizes. That is the number of home range centers that are located in each pixel. Now we can go further than this and not just estimate density, but we can also think about modeling landscape connectivity. So these spatial capture-recapture models allow us to make explicit inference about landscape connectivity from these encounter history data. Now, I said earlier that the SCR model was a model for detection probability that was usually based on Euclidean distance model that relates the sample locations to the latent variable or the home range center. But that distance metric can be non-Euclidean. So for example, it can be based on least cost path, where the cost is a function of some kind of landscape structure. So now we're moving away from this kind of simplistic space use model to have a more realistic space use model. So for example, here, this is the Euclidean distance model, and you can see that it's stationary and circular. But if we allow the encounter probability model to be non-Euclidean, you can see that it starts to take on the structure of the landscape, for example. Oh, and I should mention that we have a few different papers, Andy Royal and others on this first paper that came out describing this encounter probability model based on connectivity, and then two subsequent papers that myself and Andy and Chris Sutherland are co-authors on. Now, I mentioned the basic Euclidean distance model, and that Euclidean distance might not be biologically reasonable, of course, when the landscape structure influences movement. So that's when we move away from these Euclidean distance models and go to these, what we call ecological distance models. So we might expect movement of individuals to deviate from Euclidean distance as the cost or the resistance of the landscape increases. So as some form, landscape structure is influencing that movement, we can expect that they become less and less, the movement to be less and less like Euclidean distance. And what's shown here is some kind of elevation resistance surface, and using a least cost path algorithm, we can consider a hypothetical individual that has an activity center in any of these raster cells, and we can estimate the cost of moving to any of the other raster cells in that landscape based on that covariate surface. And we can quantify this resistance with a parameter of the model. Here we call alpha 2. And so what's shown here is when alpha 2 equals 0, this is effectively the Euclidean distance model. But as the landscape structure starts to shape the movement of these individuals and becomes more and more resistant, we can see that the form of this is taking on a different shape. So the ecological distance model, as I mentioned, is adding this third parameter to the model, alpha 2, which is shown down here. And alpha 2 estimates the resistance to movement based on this landscape covariate. So for example, elevation that I showed you in the previous slide. And the resistance parameter, alpha 2, is determining how a particular landscape covariate, which is defined basically by a surface of pixel-specific covariate values, elevation again, for example, how it influences space use, which is informed by how much the observed spatial pattern of the observations that we get of these individuals deviates from the symmetric expectation. So this model can incorporate information about the landscape and also measure effective distance, which reflects animal movement in these heterogeneous landscapes. So of course, this is in contrast to the traditional or more simplistic Euclidean distance of this basic spatial capture-recapture model. So right here, we're replacing the Euclidean distance with the least cost path distance. So there's a couple benefits, of course, to this model. And first is it's a more biologically reasonable and intuitive or realistic model of individual movement. And then secondly, we can explicitly estimate resistance to a covariate surface and measure landscape connectivity from these empirical observation data from common field methods like camera trapping or hair snaring or any of these other methods that I've described before. So we're moving away from simply expert opinion-based estimates of landscape resistance to empirically estimating this. So using that least cost path algorithm, we can consider potential connectivity. So if we considered a hypothetical individual that had an activity center in any of these raster cells, we can estimate the cost of moving to all of the other raster cells in that landscape based on a covariate surface. And this potential connectivity that I'm showing here is the expected number of individuals that might use a pixel where the expectation is taken with respect to the population distribution of these activity centers S that I described before. So it estimates the encounter probability model parameters, and then those can be used to estimate these cell-specific connectivity values for any pixel in the landscape. So with this, it makes it possible to define spatially explicit measures of landscape connectivity, and we can evaluate this potential connectivity across the landscape. And here's an example here. On the left is, for example, we have this amount of development as a resistance surface where the black is development and the white is no development, for example. And we can use this to estimate potential connectivity. And we can see here, this is the area that has the highest amount of development. And if we're just using this as resistance, here we can see that the potential connectivity value is highest in this area that has little developed area. So it has lower resistance values, for example. Now we can go one step further. We've identified or defined potential connectivity, and I've described density to you here. So we have potential connectivity on the top, and here we have density on the bottom. And so this realized density down here is the number of activity centers that are in each pixel. So what we can do is we can estimate what we're calling density-weighted connectivity. And so we can do this with the parameter for resistance, the alpha 2 parameter that we're estimating with the ecological distance component of the model. So to do this, we multiply the potential connectivity by the estimated pixel location population size. So we multiply this potential connectivity by this realized density to come up with this density-weighted connectivity. So this density-weighted connectivity is the expected use of a pixel based on the estimated cost of movement weighted by the estimated density of activity centers in each of the pixels. So if you look here, if we're thinking about conservation in terms of just thinking about maintaining connectivity, we would select this area that has the highest potential connectivity. If we're only concerned about density and preserving areas that have the highest density, that area would be down here. So the highest area, the area that had the highest connectivity was up here. The area that has the highest density was down here. But density-weighted connectivity allows us to think about the combination of both connectivity and density. We can do this simultaneously. So density-weighted connectivity is suggesting this area right here has the highest density as well as connectivity of the landscape. So again, you'd be making different decisions if we were to independently use connectivity and density versus using this estimator of density-weighted connectivity. And we described density-weighted connectivity in this paper that came out in Ecosphere, Morin et al. Earlier this year. So this density-weighted connectivity is a great parameter because it represents really what we're interested in. It's a biologically based model for two of the critical processes that are required for the conservation of spatially structured populations, that is landscape connectivity and density. And it's all rolled into one, and it's estimated from empirical observation data. So obviously, this can be hugely informative about landscape planning and corridor design for conservation of wildlife populations that are threatened by things like habitat loss or fragmentation. And so we end up with two of these model-based estimators of landscape connectivity. We have potential connectivity, and we have density-weighted connectivity. So the next question is, okay, well, now we can estimate these things. Well, what do we do with these in practice? So that gets us to applications of optimal design. So this spatial capture-recapture models are allowing us to come up with explicit density estimates in this estimator of density-weighted connectivity. And these are the surfaces that would be used to select pixels for integration into some kind of landscape design or corridor application. But selecting the best pixels indicated by these different surfaces doesn't take into account anything like budget constraints, and it's not guaranteed to give us the most cost-effective solution for a specified budget, for example. So enter the computer scientists. And again, that's the nature of this collaboration is trying to figure out now how do we effectively design these sustainable landscapes. And so we're working with Amrita and Bistra at Georgia Tech to think about optimal wildlife reserve design using the spatial capture-recapture based conservation objectives. And this is in collaboration with Dana Morin, Andy Royal, Chris Sutherland, and Carla Gomes. So the objectives of this work are to use our density and connectivity models to help us make landscape scale decisions, to help us make decisions about what particular landscape parcels are more important than others to have a connected landscape. So we can formulate these optimization problems that incorporate specific budget constraints. And so the question is, which pixels are we going to protect to maximize the ecological benefit, for example, density-weighted connectivity, without exceeding a specified budget? Now, there's two different considerations here. One is that the reserve design should protect an individual only if its home range is protected. So we need some area or amount of that home range to protect. And then the reserve design needs to maintain the connectivity between two different pixels. So both of those pixels need to be conserved if there's high connectivity. And so what they did is took an integer linear formulation of this problem. And the decision is, okay, we need to decide which pixels we're going to protect without exceeding a specified budget B. And we need to think about, as I mentioned, we need to protect an individual only if its home range is protected. So the activity center, the S that I described before, has to be selected, as well as surrounding pixels that have a high use probability. And so that's denoted by H here. Now, the value of H can depend on different biological or ecological reasons. So we could vary the amount of H that's required to protect in addition to the home range center S. And there are a number of reasons why we might select a different value for H. And we're exploring those different options at this point. So to maximize ecological benefit, we can think about two different objectives, conservation-related objectives. One, we could think about maximizing realized density, so that's the total number of individuals that we're going to protect on the landscape. And another conservation objective might be to maximize density-weighted connectivity that I've already described. So we want to maximize the probability of these selected pixels being used by those protected individuals. So those are the areas that have a lot of connectivity and a high density of individuals. And so the research questions in this work, we have two primary ones, although there are some other ones that I don't mention here. One is the choice of the objective. So of course, there's probably some trade-offs that can be made between optimizing for a conserved population, that is the realized density, or incorporating connectivity requirements into the optimization, so using density-weighted connectivity. And the second is, what's the effect of fragmentation and resistance? So how do landscape-related features and species-specific characteristics affect the reserve design using this approach? So what we've done is develop synthetic landscapes that we vary the amount of fragmentation that allows us to address the second objective. So I'm not presenting the results of this work because they're still ongoing, but I want to highlight some of the work that we're doing in collaboration with the Computational Sustainability Research Network. Now, we have a second challenge, and that second challenge is that animal density and connectivity can change dynamically and non-linearly with different habitat protection plans. So that is the spatial proximity of these different landscape parcels influence parcel-specific density and connectivity values for a species. So that a change to any single parcel, for example, can result in different density and connectivity values of nearby parcels. So we can think about this as a protected pixel having more value than a non-protected pixel, or the change from non-protection to protection, for example, might confer some conservation benefit that then reduces its resistance. So you can imagine as you start changing the resistance values, then ultimately we end up changing potentially the density-weighted connectivity and the animal density. So enter more computer scientists. So this is where we started engaging with Ye Shin and Xiaojian and Carla. And this is in collaboration, again, with Dana Morin and Bistra and Andy Royal. And the effort here is to think about this dynamic problem. And here we make the assumption that if an edge is, here we have resistance up here, and these protected edges are in these gray lines. So protecting the edges is going to reduce the resistance value. And here we have density-weighted connectivity. So we're making the assumption that if an edge is protected, it's going to decrease the resistance of that edge. So the optimization question then becomes, under a given budget, what is the best set of edges that we can protect that improves density-weighted connectivity the most? And I don't claim to understand all of everything that these guys were doing here in terms of the last bullet here. But essentially, the approach dynamically optimizes density-weighted connectivity given certain budget constraints, and it allows us to capture this dynamic and nonlinear connectivity change with the different protection plans. And the third point is where it gets beyond me. So it's scalable by sampling the objective function both intelligently and adaptively by solving this optimization problem subject to these additional XOR constraints. And I'm sure Ye Shin or Carla can explain this part in more detail. So the next steps, I've described where we are to date. The next steps, there are several of them that I want to mention here, where we intend to go in the future. The next one is we have over 6,000 photographs of Andean bears, and now we need to individually identify these Andean bears from their facial markings. So you can imagine human observers going through 6,000 photos from last season and probably another 6,000 to 10,000 photos from this field season. It's a lot of human effort required to do that. So again, we're going to be collaborating with the Computational Sustainability Research Network to help us in coming up with a more automated approach for this individual identification. And we're working on ways that not only can we identify the individual, but also these spatial capture-recapture models now can incorporate partial information. So for example, if we can't specify with 100% certainty that it's an individual, but we can exclude 5,000, or we can exclude 300 of the other individuals and say it might be a subset of these individuals. That information is useful for us. And then the second step here, again, this is the kind of next steps that I'm going to be presenting are steps for which we don't have funding at this point, but that we hope to obtain in the future. Then this next step relates to the component that I didn't talk about at all. I mentioned that Andean bears could be used as this focal species for conservation of biodiversity, and using these camera trap photos, we can think about other mammalian species that we get on the camera traps, but really we're not thinking about any of these bird species that I mentioned in one of these opening slides. So we'll be working with Amanda Roderwald, who's part of this team of investigators working on the Ecuador project, to start thinking about how Andean bears actually serve as an umbrella species for other species, such as the whole host of bird species that exist in this landscape. The other step is there's a whole social science inquiry part of this that I didn't describe. I was just describing some of the one part of the ecological part of the process. And so the questions are related to thinking about alternative incentive schemes that could encourage local communities to practice land use, or to have land use practices that are consistent with our corridor objectives. Another one is to look at a spatial evaluation of ecosystem services that are important to these local communities. So if we can identify ecosystem services that are highly valued by local communities, then those local communities might have values that are more consistent with the conservation of biodiversity. So we would like to evaluate the social preferences by communities toward the protection of these specified ecosystem services, and also what's the social capacity of these communities for engaging in conservation practices. And now the approach that we need to take here, of course, is an approach that's going to be spatial, because we need to have the social science data to be spatially depicted, just as all of the data that I presented on the ecological data. So basically we need to figure out what's the spatial distribution of these place-based values of the communities for these ecosystem services and conservation benefits. And we're going to be working with Rich Stedman in the Department of Natural Resources at Cornell on this piece. But again, this is a piece that we don't yet have funding for. So this is in the next step or next phase category. Now, I'd like to mention, those are kind of the next steps. I'd like to mention some future challenges that that I'd like folks to consider here, or things that this larger group is considering. One is that eventually, once we figure out that social science piece of the work and we're able to characterize these social values spatially, we need to integrate the ecological, the social, and the economic objectives all into the optimization problem. So we started out pretty simplistically, well, kind of simplistically, on the examples that I presented you before, where we're just thinking about conservation related to objectives around density-weighted connectivity for the ecological components. But we also need to think about this in terms of the social perspective and the economic perspective. We also need to integrate additional species into this. So again, we're just dealing with Andean bears, for example. But if we get the additional information on other aspects of biodiversity, for example, working with Amanda Roderwald, then we could start integrating additional species or characterizing communities of species to start integrating into the optimization. And then finally, what we need is robust landscape management designs that are allowing for the incorporation of dynamic and oftentimes uncertain landscape changes rather than just static management. So as I mentioned before, these landscape changes can result in different landscape resistance values, which then can change how connected landscapes are for species. And of course, this really makes long-term conservation planning challenging, and also especially challenging to solve computationally. So these kinds of stochastic dynamic problems require more thought in terms of conservation planning. And this is an area that I'd like to investigate in the future. So how can we design these robust or redundant solutions that allow us to account for these large sources of uncertainty that might exist, for example, wildfires or climate change, or even model uncertainty in terms of the spatial capture-recapture model that I described. So that's kind of areas for the future. And I'd like to acknowledge a whole host of folks here. I mentioned this work that I presented is just a small aspect of the larger project, and so I'd like to acknowledge folks that are involved in the larger effort, and those include Jim Lasoy, Amanda Rodewald, Rich Stedman, Santiago Molina, Jeff Meacham, and formerly Greg Poe. I'd like to thank the Secretary of Environment in Ecuador for supporting this project. The Atkinson Center for a Sustainable Future provided the first funding that allowed us to get started on this project. The NSF Expeditions and Computing Award. We have local partners, including Conde San, that is helping us to manage the field-based efforts in Ecuador. Wildlife Conservation Society in Ecuador has been a great partner with us. And we also thank funding from the International Association of Bear Research and Management. And now I'll take any questions. That was very odd, talking to people that don't respond, so.
We'll respond now.
What's that?
We'll respond now.
Okay, okay.
So first of all, that was a great talk. It was long, but I've got 3 or 4 students starting June 1. I think we're going to sit down and dissect this talk together, because it's good to see all this material in one talk. It sort of gives a big picture of the reasons for some of this. But as you were talking, I was thinking, now what did you call I want to say umbrella species?
Yeah, there's different, they have slightly different definitions for how you're characterizing them, but you can think of it as there are different definitions for an umbrella species or a focal species or a flagship species, but we can just, for here, characterize them in a general sense as a species that has enough. If you protect the habitat for those species, then it should confer benefits to other species that have similar habitat requirements.
So let me give you an attempt at a computer science type definition of what an umbrella species might be. It would have to do with the ease and accuracy with which you could estimate the species densities, together with the extent to which knowledge of that species density would condition in such a way that you could accurately predict the densities of other species in the area. Mm-hmm. And I think it'd be a fairly straightforward expected value definition of maybe one way of defining an umbrella species. But is there any other work on trying to formalize what an umbrella species is? I might take a stab at formalizing it and writing down that formalization the next few days. But any other work on trying to formalize it mathematically or computationally?
So unfortunately, there's a lot of work that suggests that it's a good idea to use umbrella species for efforts related to conservation, but very infrequently are they actually formally evaluated at how well they're doing. And so one of the hopes in the work that we're doing is to actually evaluate how well the Andean bears do at protecting these other species. And so the camera trap information that we have allows us to, get Andean bears, but also all of these other species that we're getting on the camera trap. Some of them, we might be able to identify individuals and then estimate density. Others, we probably can't identify the individuals, so we can, for example, develop occupancy models related to what habitat features, for example, are influencing the occupancy dynamics of these species. And we can also start looking at the kind of co-occurrence dynamics for the species that we don't have actual individual identification on. And so we can say, are Andean bears, for example, co-occurring with these other species that we're getting on these camera traps? And so in that sense, we can start to formalize this idea about how well they're actually doing at the conservation of biodiversity, if we want to use that as a term.
Okay, great.
But I'm not aware of formal mathematical definitions that might be used to approximate an umbrella species. But great area for investigation for sure.
Well, I'm kind of thinking more broadly too about the relationship between prediction and which is descriptive in its orientation, and planning, which is prescriptive in its orientation, and you know, the relationship between supervised learning, which is concerned with predicting, if you will, densities of one focal species, versus unsupervised learning, which is oriented towards predicting, in this setting, the densities of many species. So thinking about it in terms of machine learning paradigms, I think is at least interesting for me. So
yeah, great. Yeah, thanks.
Other questions? Wait, here's somebody on the chat window if you want to go there, Angela, but I'll read it.
Oh, hold on. I haven't figured out how to do that yet.
Well, I'm going to read it anyways.
Okay.
From Jocelyn Eichrig. Any thoughts on how you could create connectivity for multiple species using SCR, resistance, and social factors?
Yeah, so right now I just described it with one species, but it's not a stretch to then incorporate multiple species into this in the same spatial capture-recapture model. And that's something kind of down the road that's kind of a relatively simple extension of that paper that I mentioned, those 3 different papers on the ecological distance model. And I think in the paper by Sutherland et al., we actually mentioned that that's possible. We don't actually formalize it in any of these papers, but it is possible.
Okay. Other questions? Okay, I'm not seeing other questions. Wait, here's one.
No, I was just saying maybe because it's, you know, over an hour.
Oh, I know. We have one question from Trishna. So how about if I ask that one, Carla, and then we end it. This is from Trishna. Is it possible to combine multiple resistance surfaces and look at the proportional contribution due to other layers?
Combine multiple resistance surfaces, right. I think that should be possible. Yes, I mean, we could evaluate basically we could evaluate multiple different resistance surfaces and then look at the resistance values as a function of these different layers that we might be using to characterize the landscape. So that's easily doable.
Without resources like camera traps, how best can we assess the structural connectivity of corridors?
Without information like camera traps?
Right.
Well, I mean, so the functional connectivity is the response of the individuals about movement within this area. So we need some kind of information on movement that can be obtained in some way that helps us to characterize the movement process itself. So there are a number of different methods that allow us to collect information on movement. I mean, the traditional ones that I didn't mention, of course, make it limited in their inference. So the ones that we used to use in the past were, you know, you'd put a radio collar on an individual and then you could track it through time and you get very fine-scaled movement information. But the problem with this is that really what we want is we want to scale up our inferences to the population level. And so by only monitoring a couple individuals, really we're not at that level of the population. And so these methods that allow us to sample populations over very wide regions, for example, the camera trapping or the hair snare or using these scat detection dogs or things like that, allow us to sample animal populations over a much wider area, and also allows us to get information on many more individuals than historically we've been able to do. So, I mean, there are combinations of these two things where you could do these non-invasive genetic approaches and then pair them with more fine-scaled telemetry information. But you need some kind of information about movement of these individuals through the landscape, whether they be from the more fine-scaled data or the widely distributed non-invasive approaches.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you so much, Angela, and thanks for everyone for joining us today. Again, great talk, and let's give her another thank you.
All right, thanks everybody. I can't see anybody out there other than Doug and the Carla group. So whoever's on, thank you for attending. I can't see your faces, but thanks for showing up virtually.
Thanks,
All righty,
Angela.
everybody.
All right, thanks.
Talk to you
Oh,
later.
hi, Bistra.
I'm here. I have video. You don't see me?
No, I just saw you just now.
He has to scroll down the line of panelists to see everybody.
Okay, okay.
Doug, where can you announce the next seminar?
I'm giving the next seminar on June 2nd.
Oh.
And yes.
Oh,
So,
that's awesome.
we will send out that announcement soon, because Christiane is going to be on me soon. But I'm about to go into the wilderness and do some backpacking, so I will be offline for a few days and then for a good long week later after that. But I'll be back for the talk.
Great. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks,
everyone.
everyone.